Everyone, and welcome to this evening's speaker series program for the Jacksonville Historical Society. This evening's program topic is in observation of Black History Month. The month of February this year, as every year, is in commemoration of this nation's Black history, and we always try to associate the Jacksonville Historical Society's speaker series program topic with a national theme interpreted in a Jacksonville context. And that's what we'll be hearing this evening. Before we turn to our guest, I want to thank everybody for coming out to Zoom with us on this rainy Thursday evening, sorry. I'd like to also thank our regular speaker series underwriter, Retina Associates, Dr. Fred Lambro and Dr. Mansour Mughal. We also receive financial support and underwriting for the Jacksonville Historical Society's work from the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville and the City of Jacksonville. We have a number of corporate sponsors and underwriters who also support our activities. To name just a few of those, ViStar Credit Union, the Haskell Company, and Crowley Maritime, along with a number of other corporate and individual and foundation underwriters. We're also grateful for the support and engagement of people like you, our members and our friends. If you are not a member of the Jacksonville Historical Society, we would welcome you and encourage you to visit our website at jackshistory.org. During the program, I encourage you to post any questions or comments that you have to the chat. And at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a function, a little button right about in the middle of the screen. It might not appear unless you move your cursor down there to the screen, at which point that little dashboard will illuminate and you can see the chat function. I certainly invite and encourage you to use that to post questions. And with that, I'll say thanks and welcome again to everyone. And I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. David Jameson. Dr. Jameson is a professor of history at Edward Waters College and a member of the board of directors of the Jacksonville Historical Society. He will introduce this evening's guest, and I thank him for his participation and all of you for being here.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone. It's really great to see you here and really appreciate that you've shown interest. I just want to say that in the short time that I've been in Jacksonville, Jerry Urso has been a great help to me. He's been a great friend and someone who I've always been able to rely on and refer to, especially in regard to his knowledge and passion about the history of Jacksonville and Black Jacksonville. So I just very excited and happy to see him here introducing and presenting the topic that he loves. Jerry attended Quinsigamond College and the College of the Holy Cross. He attained bachelor's and master's in theology at Trinity International University. He's a president of Alexander H. Darn's research chapter here in Jacksonville. He has a fellowship with the Phylaxis Society and the Lux E. Tenbris research chapter. He's a board member of the Real Rosewood Foundation and the July Perry Foundation, and education director of the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge Foundation, a member of the Cairo fraternity, and a past master of the Solly Mitchell Lodge 377 in Jacksonville, Florida. I welcome you and present to you the Grand Historian of the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge of Florida, Jerry Urso. Jerry?
Greetings. I extend you greetings from the 19th Most Worshipful Grand Master, the Honorable Jeffrey G. Jones. I also like to mention that Attorney Brandon Cooper, who is the president of the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge Foundation, is also on the call. He's being the president of our foundation is the charitable wing of what we do, and he has been extremely dedicated to education and raising scholarship money so students can attend colleges in the state of Florida. Little bit, the Marcus Cicero, I had, like I told Kate when we first came in, is not actually my middle name. So Facebook allows you to change your middle name every 60 days. So I've always put my favorite writers. So I've gone from John Quincy Adams to Marcus Aurelius to Imhotep to Mark Twain. And this month is Marcus Cicero. so I don't want to get anybody confused. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with a lot of Masonic details, but I think it is important to tell a little bit how the Grand Lodge actually came into being, and then from there, I want to celebrate many of our brightest stars and tallest cedars. If we was actually to do a presentation of everyone that made a contribution to Jacksonville, Florida, American history and international history, would probably be a 10-part series, 2 hours long each. Through my research of the last 10 years, it's just been amazing how many people memories that we've been able to resurrect that have been lost to history. And tonight, I'm going to mix in a few familiar names and hopefully introduce you to a lot of people that have been forgotten, that we definitely need to uplift their memories for their contribution to the city of Jacksonville, the state of Florida, the United States of America, and some of them on the international stage. So the Grand Lodge actually got founded on June 17th, 1870, where 3 lodges, Mount Moriah, St. John's Lodge, came together to form their own Grand Lodge. Now, there was many independent lodges in the state of Florida and several in Jacksonville, but Masonic protocol is that it takes 3 lodges to form a Grand Lodge on their own. So there was a special deputy from the state of New York that was sent to Jacksonville, Florida. His name is Dr. Joseph Robert Love, who referred to himself as Robert Love. He's a very interesting person. He actually was the head of school through the Freedmen's Bureau and the Episcopal Church, and the school was actually located on the footprint of where the old Jacksonville Library is located on Catherine and Adams Street. Dr. Love is to Jamaica, Haiti, or the Caribbean as a whole what Martin Luther King is to us in the United States. He was a revolutionary. He left the Episcopal, he went from a curate of the Episcopal Church over on Adams Street to being the first pastor of St. Philip's Church in downtown Jacksonville. He ultimately ended up going to Savannah, Georgia. Then he went to the University of Buffalo, where he graduated with a medical degree, the first African-American to graduate with a medical degree. He returned home to the Bahamas, and then he moved to Haiti, and then ultimately Jamaica. And while in the Caribbean, he was the leader of the Pan-African movement. He was actually the founder of Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey used his writings to start that movement in the United States. So he was a heavy influence on Marcus Garvey. And that's a picture of Dr. Love. We're actually making a presentation because St. Philip's Church did not have a photo of him. So we'll be presenting a photo of Dr. Love to St. Philip's Church so they can have a picture of their first pastor. The Honorable Joseph Tower was the second Grand Master in the state of Florida, and he became the first municipal court judge in Jefferson County, and he actually died as soon as he got in the seat in 1872. But it's really important that he was one of the first African American to serve as a municipal court judge, and it was the same year as Dr. Joseph E. Lee became a municipal court judge here in Jacksonville, Florida. And they were friends and contemporaries. So the Union Grand Lodge founded 5 years later. So the first Grand Lodge was called the Most Worshipful Sovereign Grand Lodge of Florida, Ancient York Masons. So then there was another Grand Lodge that was formed. It was called Union Grand Lodge. And if many of you from the Historical Society, I'm sure, are familiar with Mitchell P. Chappell, who was the city councilman in La Villa. He actually owned a few taverns, and his nephew was Pat Chappell that went on to own the Rabbit's Foot and became one of the founders of vaudeville. His brother was Julius Caesar Chappell, who left Jacksonville, Florida to go to Massachusetts and ended up becoming one of the members of the House of Representatives on the famous Ward 9 that was occupied by Lewis Hayden. And he was actually as in demand a speaker as Frederick Douglass in the mid to late 1800s. So Julius Caesar Chappelle is another person that needs to get remembered because he was often very quoted. And the difference between him and Frederick Douglass is Frederick Douglass's library is here that we can study, and there's very few copies of speeches or a library of all the writings of Julius Caesar Chappelle. So the first Grand Master of Union Grand Lodge was a man by the name of Harry Henry Thompson, and I've been working with Joe McKeechin because he's interred at Old City Cemetery, and hopefully this year we're going to be able to get him a proper tombstone. So he was the first Grand Master. He was a member of the 3rd United States Colored Infantry that was encamped here in Jacksonville, Florida. And upon his term in 1877 as Grand Master, he also petitioned Ulysses S. Grant to be a lieutenant, and he was granted a commission as an officer in the 4th United States Cavalry. So he's one of the first African Americans to hold that position of lieutenant right after the Civil War. So he's also someone that is very significant to Jacksonville history. The second, the third Grand Master is Bishop Abraham Grant. Now, if any of you have been to Sunday school, you know the story that Abram became Abraham after God had told him that he'd be the father of many nations. So when Bishop Grant became the bishop of the AME Church, he actually changed his name from Abram to Abraham. And he's another interesting person that he was actually one of the first to dine in the White House before officially they say that Booker T. Washington was, but there's actually documentation that he met with Teddy Roosevelt and had a very close relationship with Teddy Roosevelt. He started Allen Chapel AME Church here in Jacksonville. He also was the founder of one of the founders of St. Paul AME Church also. He moved to Texas. He was a Grand Master here when John Scott passed away in chambers in Tallahassee in the Florida House of Representatives. And then when he got ordained a bishop, he moved to Texas, where he became the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Texas. And he actually became Booker T. Washington's mentor. He was a trustee at Edward Waters College. He was a trustee of Payne. He was a trustee of Wilberforce and Prairie View. So he was very committed to education. And actually, when he passed away, there was a heartfelt condolences from Teddy Roosevelt to his wife, Florida. So the merger came when the two Grand Lodges came together, and that's how we have our name, the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge of Florida. There was a schism in Masonry at the time. And, you had a lot of people going to the top, and, a lot of former slaves, a lot of people didn't have, there was a lot of, I say jealousy. There was a lot of people that didn't want to let go of their positions of power after not having any. So there was some schisms going on, but there was what's called the Delaware Convention. So the independent Grand Lodges and the National Grand Lodges decided to merge together. So that's how we have only one Grand Lodge, official Prince Hall Masonic Grand Lodge in Florida, the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge. Mitchell P. Chappelle being a deacon at Bethel Baptist Church, we know that on the corner of Orange and Julia Streets, we was the first Grand Lodge of the Independent Grand Lodge, and we also know across the street from Bethel Baptist, currently where the Jacksonville College, Jacksonville State College is located, the parking lot is actually where the Union Grand Lodge headquarters was, Masonic Temple. Now, this is another man that has been completely forgotten to Jacksonville history. He actually built, as a contractor, most of the wooden structures in La Villa. His name was Tillman Valentine. So Sergeant Valentine was a member of the 33rd United States Colored Infantry. You can see in the photo that that picture was taken on 140 Court Street in Boston. What happened was that his regiment was the first African-American regiment to get their orders from Camp William Penn. And this was a result of Frederick Douglass giving a speech in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, saying, "Colored men of Pennsylvania, your place is in the Army." Grandmaster Thompson and Valentine, you also know Josiah Walls, also referred to as General Walls. Many of these men were from that area of Pennsylvania and joined the 33rd Colored Infantry. They were not granted a parade, as was the custom of all the other units that had graduated from Camp William Penn. So they were actually assigned to Boston, where they got their training from the Massachusetts 54th. I want to read part of understanding Tillman Valentine. It's, very few letters exist from members of the infantry to their families. And I wanted to read a portion. I had received your letter of joy to think that you're in good spirits, and moreover that you have plenty to eat, he wrote on December 26, 1863, in his letter from Morris Island. For some time I had been away on the furthest post, and the rebels were not far from me. I look upon the stars and I ask God to bless you and take care of you. Valentine described walking boldly ahead of his men, knowing that God was able and willing to answer his prayers, from which to spare him from his family from agony. He asked God to give all the people, but it's hard to read because a lot of this is in vernacular at the time, but a thumb full of yourself, he wrote. He asked her to kiss his children in a postscript. Keep your spirits up, and I will think you happy someday to learn that the children will be able to read. The guns had turned over, and the horse had crushed my leg, which prevented me from being broken, but it was badly crushed, and I was taken from my tent and excused from duty. He later recalled that he would return to duty with a limp because he did not want to leave his men. And further on in the letter, he describes what it is to be, as a black man, to be in charge of a unit. He was the sergeant of Company B. He is interred over at City Cemetery. So, and there's a copy of the actual letter that he wrote to his wife, Annie, from Morris Island. Grandmaster Samuel Coleman was an educator, and he was in charge of the education for the Florida East Conference of the African American Episcopal Church. This is an actual copy of a letter that he wrote to Wilberforce University to the attention of Frederick Douglass, where he's asking for funds to start a school in Live Oak, Florida. And as you know, that school had became Edward Waters College here in Jacksonville, Florida. So we're going to move on to our Grand East. So after the Great Fire of 1901, there was a lot of division in the Grand Lodge on where to put the new Grand East. Many people wanted it in Orlando, Florida, because they thought it was more central, and then the other faction wanted to keep it in Jacksonville because this is where the Grand Lodge was founded. We had gone through a lot of bitter fights for recognition, especially from our white counterparts. If you look at the top of the building, this is in 1912, where they had just finished putting in the windows, and you see that the drugstore and Anderson and Tucker Bank is not yet moved in. And at the very top, you see a Masonic symbol, the square and the compass. Well, at that same time, 1912, the Knights of Pythius, which are located on Broad Street, was involved in a bitter lawsuit that was picked up by an attorney named Daniel Webster Perkins, who also would fight for the ancient Arabic order, the ancient Egyptian Arabic order, nobles of the Mystic Shrine. He would also be a part of the lawsuit that took that case to the Supreme Court. Both of those court cases were successful, which every African-American fraternity should be grateful for D.W. Perkins and those other attorneys who won the right for regalia, the name and uses of the officers and the emblems. so they could be used. So for us, they denied us the right for the square and compass, but we was able to win that lawsuit. But in the meantime, they had never put back that square and compass that you see located at the top of the building. This is the Grand Master Dickenson. He was the Grand Master at the time of the Great Fire of 1901. And one of the little known secrets is how much money and services that the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge had provided to the citizens of Jacksonville, especially downtown Jacksonville. This is a copy. This is taken from the 1901 Friday, May 3rd. He wrote a letter and had it sent to every Masonic jurisdiction, white and black, throughout the whole world. This was also in the Cleveland Dealer and the Pacific Appeal, and this was actually taken for the Pacific Appeal, where he discusses how the 150 blocks and over 2,000 acres to 20,000 people were held homeless. $25 million worth of property had been damaged, and he was asking for shoes, clothing, anything of substance that they could supply to the people of Jacksonville during this time, and that the address was one that they asked all the money to be sent to was his office, which was located on 1332 West Adams Street. So these pictures were taken from the Crisis magazine. There are 3 pictures. If you see the top with the staging as they were getting ready to install the windows, that's a picture of Broad Street before the building was built. I got that from the Historical Society. And to the right is the 1912 photo that was the completed photo. And at the time, when this was published in Crisis magazine, W.E.B. Du Bois described this as the finest African-American building in the entire South, that it was the most magnificent, the most expensive. It was a source of pride when they wrote that article. When he published it in the Crisis magazine. Next, I'd like to, since we discussed we've been in this pandemic, Dr. Daniel Webster Roberts is another person who was a member of Mount Horeb Lodge in St. Augustine. So Dr. Roberts actually had one of the largest medical practices of any doctors, white or black. During the pandemic, he had come up with some medicine that helped people to from suffering from the Spanish flu, and he never lost one patient. And doctors from all over the state of Florida descended on St. Augustine to take audience with Daniel Webster Roberts, so as to how to treat patients during the Spanish flu epidemic. His protege was a dentist by the name of Dr. A.E. Welters. He owned the tooth powder company. If you see the location of the tooth powder company was 410 Broad Street, and to the right is his automobile. Now, this picture was taken around 1930, and the Dodge Motor Corporation took a hearse, one of their hearse from the fleet of hearses that they make, and made a special vehicle or truck for Dr. Welters to carry his tooth powder. So he opened up on 410 Broad Street, which is the Masonic Temple. He opened up the manufacturing plant was located in Baltimore, Maryland, and he ultimately went to Chicago, Illinois, where he served the legislature for over 25 years, and he is also a member of the FAMU Hall of Fame. So he had a partnership with Madam C.J. Walker, and if you can see, you have his letterhead, the Dr. A.E. Welters Tooth Powder Company, and it's a letter that he wrote to Madam C.J. Walker, and the two of them exchanged products. So she would carry his tooth powder products, and he would carry Madam C.J. Walker's hair products, and they were sold right there on 410 Broad Street. This is probably one of the most influential attorneys in Florida history that nobody ever heard of. He was a mentor to D.W. Perkins. He was actually from Rhode Island, from the famous Ballou family. That's not his picture. That's actually his father. He was a mixed race man, and he petitioned the cohabitation laws in the state of Rhode Island, argued before the Supreme Court. So 100 years before the Loving lawsuit that went before the Supreme Court in Virginia, he actually petitioned all the way to the Supreme Court to end cohabitation laws in the state of Rhode Island. He moved to Jacksonville, Florida, where he was a civil rights attorney located on 410 Broad Street. He also operated 2 African-American newspapers at 410 Broad Street, and then he moved to Alabama. This is one of my favorite pictures of Daniel Webster Perkins. His daughter didn't even have this picture. I had found this at in Tennessee. So this is his graduation picture. So as we discussed earlier, Daniel Webster Perkins is without parallel in Jacksonville, as one of the great civil rights attorneys. Like I said, he actually argued in the state of Tennessee to have African Americans included in jury pools. He was the first African American lawyer to argue a case with African Americans on the jury. He also was survived, and in 1974, when he passed away, they had a horse and carriage that marched from Bethel Baptist Church to Evergreen Cemetery, and there was, I believe it was over 1,000 people walked that great distance to Evergreen Cemetery to see that Daniel Webster Perkins was interred. And one of the people that, and this is a copy of his stationery. I don't think it will get delivered anymore, but back in those 1950, they didn't even use 410 Broad Street as the address. They just wrote Room 214, Colored Masonic Temple, Jacksonville, Florida. This is George Edwin Taylor. He is actually the first African American, which was over 100 years before Shirley Chisholm. Or close to it. He is actually the first African American ever to run for president of the United States, and he ran on the Labor Party. He moved from Iowa to Jacksonville, Florida, after his unsuccessful attempt to run for president, not receiving any electoral votes. Many people scoffed at him and laughed at him, but he thought at that time that it was a great thing that an African American would even try to run for president of the United States. While here in Jacksonville, Florida, he was worked in the printing industry. He also was a advocate and a contemporary of Captain J.W. Floyd, James Weldon Johnson, J. Douglas Wetmore. So his presence was a large presence to us for someone held in such high esteem. And one of the people that Daniel Webster Perkins also inspired was Florida's first African-American Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Leander Jerry Shaw. And we have a copy of the marble plate that was on the first floor of the Grand Lodge located to his office. He was also a member of Rabia Temple number 8, which is still located on Liberty Street. He was actually one of the nobles to help put together the funds to purchase that building that we have over on 27th Street in Liberty. So in 1920, the women got the right to vote through the United States, through the amendment to give women the right to vote. So 500 members of the Ku Klux Klan had come out on election day on November 3rd, 1920, to dissuade women from voting. There were masked men, and the night before they were intimidating people. So almost 4,000 women, many of them were members of the Order of the Eastern Star and also the members of the Heroine of Jericho, of which Eartha White was a member, and she had wrote down many of the names of all the people. So these women stood in line all day, and they were never allowed to cast their vote. But they were demanding to be heard. And this would be echoed through our Grand Lodge through the entire civil rights, history of the civil rights here in Jacksonville, Florida. also, this was also tied to the lynching of July Perry in Ocoee, Florida, where he and his wife actually registered to vote that day. And then when his friend Mose Norman was turned away 3 times, he was chased by a mob in Ocoee, Florida, to the home of July Perry, and July Perry defended his home by killing 2 of the would-be attackers, and he was ultimately lynched in Ocoee, Florida, which this would call for James Weldon Johnson and Captain J.W. Floyd of Jacksonville, Florida, to meet with the president-elect of the United States, Warren G. Harding. So they actually met with him in St. Augustine before, while he was on vacation after the election, while he was president-elect, waiting to be sworn in as president. So they took an audience with him, which was for anti-lynching legislation, which we know Eartha White was a very prominent proponent of the anti-lynching legislation. But this actually led to the Dwyer Bill, which was anti-lynching legislation. Although it failed in the Senate and passed through the House of Representatives, it was actually the first anti-lynching legislation. This is Reverend Reuben Brooks. So during the trolley cart boycott, Reuben Brooks was one of the leading voices here in Jacksonville. If y'all familiar with the case Patterson v. Florida, where Andrew Patterson wasn't allowed to on a car and refused to give up his seat, which was 50 years before Rosa Parks. So this became a big case, and Reuben Brooks as an AME minister, was able to galvanize many in the church and many in the community. So he was able to shut down the trolleys here in Jacksonville, Tallahassee, Pensacola, and Tampa, Florida. Clara White was also a member of the Heroines of Jericho and a good friend to Ada Braddock, who we'll get to shortly. So I won't have to get into her story. I know many of you know the contribution of Clara and how she adopted Eartha White, and her legacy of philanthropy inspired Eartha for her great works that she's done. And it was all because, this woman, after becoming freed, spent so much of her time to the poor and leftover people that couldn't find farms, that couldn't find employment, that she spent so much of her time in philanthropy and feeding people in the soup kitchen and so forth, that she was just an inspiration. And like Eartha spent the rest of her life dedicating herself to Clara's memory. This is my favorite picture of Joseph E. Lee with all his ribbons. He was a stalwart. He spent 50 years as pretty much the head of the Republican Party here in Jacksonville, Florida. He was a kingmaker, the first municipal court judge in Jacksonville. He's the second attorney in the state of Florida and the first to practice law in the city of Jacksonville. And you didn't get into public office without going through Joseph E. Lee. He was definitely a kingmaker, and whoever he endorsed 90% of the time would end up winning the position that they were seeking to have, elected position that they were seeking. This is Inez T. Austin Boyer. She was our Grand Worthy Matron for 50 years. She's a very important, back in Reconstruction, there's very few women, let alone African-American women, to hold national offices. She was the first vice president of the NAACP Women's Club, while Mary Bethune was the first president. So when Mary Bethune relinquished that position, she became the second president of the NAACP Women's Club. She was a champion of the women's suffrage movement. She campaigned for the women's rights to vote. She was the president of the National Council of Negro Women and the first woman to serve on the building committee for the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge of Florida. So while worthy matron, she had galvanized the women throughout the state. So that building we have on 410 Broad Street, she's one of the few women that you'll ever see on a Masonic cornerstone, because she was the one that raised much of the money. As a matter of fact, in 1946, when they paid off that mortgage, she was the Grand Master Powell had given her the honor of burning the mortgage. This is Josiah T. Walls. One of the things that I wanted to bring up tonight, since he's so well known, is that in 1870, he actually introduced the law, a bill actually, to form a canal, which is now what we consider the I-4 corridor that goes from Daytona to Tampa. He actually wanted to create a canal to benefit the people of Florida, because he thought that Florida would end up becoming the largest shipping capital in the country. So that was one of the law. And then in 1872, he actually authored a bill for the first National Education Act. As you can see, the first African Americans to serve the United States Congress and Senate. He is promptly figured in the middle. He was during his day, he was very influential. He was also a general of the Florida militia, first African American to serve Congress from the state of Florida, and he was actually the first agricultural director at Florida A&M. Ada Braddock, this is another woman who is unsung. I think she is the first African-American woman from Florida to hold a national position. I'm going to give a shameless plug that hopefully one day we can get a historical marker dedicated to this great woman so she could be honored like Clara and Eartha White. She was Ada Braddock Bracy. She was one of the most prominent women in Jacksonville in the 19th century. She was born to Samuel and Violet Williams, which they used their own money to build the first St. Paul AME Church. St. Paul AME Church actually used to meet in the living room of her parents. She married the Reverend Pembroke Braddock, who's one of the early residents of La Villa and founder of St. Paul AME. And they actually used their own money to finance the first brick structure building owned by African Americans in the state of Florida, which was the second building built by St. Paul AME Church. She ended up becoming the first most ancient grand matron, a position she would hold for 18 years. And she was also served on the Grand Court, making her the first woman in Florida to serve on a national body. She was also a member of the Good Templars, which she was the vice president under William Middleton Artrell, who was the principal of Stanton High School, who was a mentor to James Weldon Johnson, and also during the pandemic of the yellow fever epidemic in Florida, worked with Dr. Alexander Hanson Darnes, taking care of the sick here in Jacksonville. I believe he was appointed to the position of public health during that pandemic. So she was with other distinguished members, Joseph E. Lee, William Artrell Middleton, and Abram Grant were all members of the Good Templars, which was a temperance society here in Jacksonville, Florida. James Weldon Johnson was the U.S. consul to Venezuela and Nicaragua. I think that part of his story doesn't get enough credit. Matter of fact, whenever I speak of James Weldon Johnson, I like to refer to him as Ambassador or Consul Johnson, because we should be referring to people by their last title. His influence in writing, his influence in music, is not far outweighed by the fact that he was appointed by the President of the United States to be an ambassador to Venezuela and Nicaragua. That his opinion so mattered that President McKinley actually sought his advice President Harding sought his advice, and they actually became friends. I'm actually working with the Harding Library to get some of the correspondences between Harding and Johnson. And Johnson was told by President Harding not to hold his tongue. So when it came to the situation in Haiti and United States involvement in Haiti, James Weldon Johnson was not afraid to blast the administration's position on the treatment of the people of Haiti. So his influence as an ambassador, it doesn't get the recognition that it actually deserves. Blanche May Armwood, she's also the first wife of D.W. Perkins, the first African-American woman to graduate with a law degree in the state of Florida. She was also a contemporary of Eartha White, and she was an opera singer. So the two of them during from the early 1900s, from the 1920s, had an audience with the presidents and kings and queens in Ireland, Britain, Italy. So they used their influence to put pressure on the political figures in Europe, to put pressure on the United States of America for anti-lynching legislation. And that's a picture of with her father. Her father was actually the first Black police officer in the state of Florida when he was appointed that position in Hillsborough County. John Willis Maynard was the first African-American ever elected to Congress, while he was elected by the citizens of Louisiana, but he was not seated. So before Hiram Rebels and Robert Smalls, he was actually the first one to win an election, but Congress refused to seat him. He moved to Jacksonville, Florida, where he became a prominent printer and a member of our Grand Lodge. And then he moved to Key West, Florida, and opened several newspapers there. But the illustrator was also located here in Jacksonville, Florida. Zora Neale Hurston was a member of the Eatonville chapter, Order of the Eastern Star. She also would report on that July Perry lynching in Ocoee, Florida. She used a lot of her influence as a, we know her as a writer, we know of her as a poet and author of several books, but she was also a prominent journalist, and she was a storyteller of a lot of the things, similar to the way James Weldon Johnson did when he was the field secretary for the NAACP. They had some of the most dangerous jobs in America. Like, she would go to wherever these, racial incidents took place and interview people, which was really dangerous. James Weldon Johnson, the same thing. Think of Red Summer in 1919. James Weldon Johnson is in all these small towns in Mississippi and Alabama, Florida, interviewing people for all these lynchings that were going on. So her work as a journalist is something that we need to commemorate. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk about is the Honorable Thomas Warren Long. So his story starts right here in Jacksonville, Florida. He was a slave on the Roberts Plantation, which was located on West Beaver Street. So he was also a minister on that plantation. So word through the different slave networks found out that the 1st Carolina Volunteers were encamped in Yulee, Florida. So he actually would kiss his wife and children goodbye, and on foot hoofed it from the Roberts Plantation on Beaver Street under the cover of darkness, where he would enlist at the 1st Carolina Volunteers. His commanding officer was Colonel Thomas Timothy Higginson, where the two of them would become fast friends. And when he wrote his memoir of leading a white officer leading a Black regiment, he leaned on many quotes of Thomas Warren Long. So after the war, Thomas Warren Long became a war hero. As a matter of fact, during the Battle of Ulusty, he went on a suicide mission to burn down one of the wooden bridges so the Confederates couldn't breathe cannon fire during the Battle of Ulusty. Even though the Union lost that battle, it would have been a complete wipeout if they had ever gotten the artillery into that area of Lake City. So he had won several accommodations and then worked his way up from enlisting, and within 2 years became a corporal, and then he became a sergeant in the 1st Carolina Volunteers, even when they changed their name to the 33rd United States Colored Infantry. On the bottom of that picture to the left, you'll see him seated next to Grand Master Coleman and the Deputy Grand Master of this jurisdiction, one of the founders of Edward Waters College. You also see picture Morris, and that was Bishop Arnett. I apologize. And then in the bottom right picture, you see the gentleman holding the hat that is Thomas Warren Long when he was elected to the state Senate representing Madison County. So he was actually one of the last African Americans to serve in the Florida Senate during Reconstruction. He was the founder of several Masonic lodges, and he's one of the leading ministers of the AME Church, where he actually founded 12 AME churches through the state of Florida, where he spent most of his life either on foot or on horseback, starting all these churches. He would return to Jacksonville, Florida, where he would pass away and be buried in Palatka. And passing the torch, our Grand Master, Grand Master, 19th Most Worshipful Grand Master, the Honorable Jeffrey G. Jones. He is dedicated to the historical significance of this Grand Lodge. So we'll be seeking your advice, as well as Joel McKeechin, as we continue to have the facade fixed on our Grand Lodge. And hopefully this year we'll be able to complete the Leander Shaw Museum, which will, and hopefully we can bring back a lot of the history that has been lost over the years and have a virtual museum at the Grand Lodge that will be part of the Jacksonville History Tour. And for that, I am finished.
Thank you, Jerry. Appreciate it. So we were going to open it up to questions. Anyone that would like to ask anything, and if not, Jerry has plenty of information to share with us. But I think there was a question there in the chat by Alan. Do you see it, Jerry?
Yes. So Joseph E. Lee was a Grand Lodge officer for the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge. His name actually appears on that cornerstone on 410 Broad Street. He was very influential in helping to raise funds, using his political influences to help raise funds for the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge. And Daniel Webster Perkins, in addition to those civil rights cases that he worked, was also mentored by J. Douglas Wetmore. Now, J. Douglas Wetmore, probably the most famous civil rights attorney nobody's ever heard of. He was the attorney for the Brownsville affair. So under the Roosevelt administration, there's 167 members of the Buffalo Soldiers were decommissioned and court-martialed, and he actually represented the Buffalo Soldiers. He represented Booker T. Washington. He represented, in one of his cases, he's actually one of the founding members of the Niagara Movement. He's one of the founding members at the NAACP. In 1901, his first report to the National Negro Business League, to Booker T. Washington, he states that African Americans actually owned 52% of the land in Jacksonville, Florida. Okay, what does a Grand Lodge mean? Okay.
Actually, if you could read the questions in case people see.
Okay.
Can you read the questions? Or?
From Terry, I am new to this. Can you explain what a Grand Lodge means and how the members are brought in? I'm a student at FSCJ, and Dr. McCormick is my wonderful Florida history professor. Okay, so every under the Masonic system, every jurisdiction is what they call independent and sovereign to themselves. So in the United States, that's the reason why we had a schism in the 1870s, because they had what was called a National Grand Lodge, which is actually a violation of Masonic protocol. So every province, which they have in Europe, that's why they have provincial Grand Masters, and in the United States, we have state Grand Masters. So the Grand Master is sovereign to himself, and he is the only authority within the state. So our Grand Master is the only authority of the Prince Hall Masonic system. And the reason why we have two goes back to all the way back to St. John's Lodge and the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, Massachusetts, going back to the days of Joseph Warren and Prince Hall. Were friends, but he never became a Mason under that system. So a man by the Sergeant Batts actually initiated him, and the Prince Hall Masonic family as all are members of what's called African Lodge 459. So a Grand Lodge is the Masonic authority, and we have what's called the Masonic Temple or Grand East, which is that building on 410 Broad Street that I discussed and showed you pictures of earlier.
Jerry, somebody Jerry, somebody wanted to know what happened to the Masonic emblem that was removed from the top of 410 East Broad.
Have no idea. I would love to have found that, but what I love is if anybody, hopefully when this pandemic is over, Alan and I really wanted to do this in person so I could give you a tour from the pillars of the basement to the actual tunnel. There's actually a tunnel that goes from our Grand Lodge to the Roosevelt Hotel, which I assume it was an escape tunnel that was built when the building was built. And the reason being that it wasn't, we had been under attack by our counterparts, even though we have what's called amenity now with each other, and the Grand Lodge of Florida and the Prince Hall Masons all recognize each other. You have to understand that in 1893, it's actually on the books, on the Florida constitutions for the Grand Lodge of Florida, that you had to be a white man to be a Mason. So technically, to be a black Mason, you were violating Florida law.
So Terry Spock wants to know, what is a Mason?
Okay. A Mason is, let me say, we are the world's oldest fraternity. Actually, we are the oldest African-American organization in the United States of America, which we go back to the 1870s, where Prince Hall and 14 other men, which we refer to as the Immortal 15, were initiated as Masons. This allows us to celebrate this St. John's days. It's a custom that goes back to the guilds in Europe. So there was what's called the guild system, and it was basically a labor union. So all of our secret handshakes and tokens and signs actually aren't nefarious. They're not evil. What happened was in the 1500s, if you were building a building and claiming to be a journeyman, you would have a handshake, because that would be the only way to know as such that you were to receive that proper wage. So it was basically a union. It was also a benevolent society. They looked out for their widows and orphans going back. So in 1717, they went from what we call the operative Masons that were actually building edifices throughout Europe, the great edifices of Europe, one of the greatest being Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, to speculative Masons, where they got involved in politics and free thinking, and some of the greatest minds have been Freemasons. If you think about some of the greatest minds, I mean, Galileo is linked to being a Mason. I don't know if it's true or not. Da Vinci was a Knight Templar. But in the United States, when you think about Prince Hall, his son actually helped raise the money to start the first African-American college in Pennsylvania. They were petitioning the colonial court. So for the abolition of slavery, they were writing letters to the governor of Thomas Gage of Massachusetts to end the fugitive slave laws in Massachusetts. So that legacy was working with the political climate to make change in the African-American community. And one of the great authors and a good friend of mine, Alonzo Tahuti Evans, refers to it as the Prince Hall plan, how these men would become big, important positions in society and would use their leverage for the benefit of African-Americans. So this fraternal system is responsible for the Divine Nine. If you look at any of the Divine Nine, they were started by Prince Hall Masons and members of the Order of the Eastern Star. We have these emblems that we use, the square and compass. These are the ways that we identify each other. And so they didn't have dues cards, they didn't have computers. So this is how we used to distinguish ourselves, to know each other, to be such. So a lot of that, these secrets and all these things that people like to use and say about us, is because people are ignorant and don't know the truth. So, I really like Roland Martin talks about Prince Hall Masonry not too long ago. And outside of the church, there is no organization that has benefited the African-American community more than Prince Hall Masons. E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Thurgood Marshall, James Weldon Johnson. I mean, all these people, I mean, you think about their influence on American history, were members of a fraternity. And, you know, the benefit of this fraternity was, how do you get a Methodist, a Baptist, an Episcopal, and a Presbyterian to come together? They couldn't do it through the church. So they become the Masonic temples. And this was Twitter. This was Facebook of especially in the 1800s during Reconstruction. How did they get the word out? How did they know what was going on in the community? How did they know what dangers were coming? These things were discussed in Masonic lodges. And in many of the small towns throughout Florida, where did you have a wedding? You couldn't have it at a white building. You couldn't have them at white hotels. And, so people had weddings, social gatherings, dances, bazaar. They used to call them bazaars. Matter of fact, the women of Rosewood used to wear red slips so men would know they were single when they took the train from Jacksonville to Rosewood to have dances on the weekends. So the women would wear a red slip and it would hang down below their dress so the men would know that they were single, because, Rosewood used to have famous for their juke joints. So while Jacksonville was dry, a lot of people used to take the Seaboard Airway down to Rosewood and party and then come back on.
Everyone for participating in this evening's speaker series. We are experimenting boldly where no Jacksonville Historical Society has gone before in virtual programming. But as we do more of these, we hope to continue to get better at it. And this evening is a program that I certainly don't intend to forget it myself. I think many of us won't. I really want to thank Brother Jerry Urso. His research and his knowledge are both prodigious, and he knows a lot more. He wasn't kidding when he said at the beginning of the program that he could put this together into another 10 or so episodes of a couple of hours apiece. So I think we'll be hearing more from Jerry and learning more about the Most Worshipful Grand Union. I responded somewhat in the chat, Jerry, to the effect that when public gatherings become somewhat safer, we hope to organize a physical event there. I was awfully privileged to have a tour of the building, compliments of Jerry, along with a few other members of our board of directors. And I can tell you that it is an imposing and really a moving experience to tour the inside of the building. A great deal of love and devotion has been poured into the stewardship of that landmark structure, and it really is worth a look. So we're looking forward to that. And thanks again, Jerry, for this presentation. We so much admire all the work and research that you do. Thanks to every one of the rest of you for joining this evening's program. More to come in March. Stand by, stay tuned, and please visit us at jackshistory.org. We would welcome your engagement with our work and your membership and support. Have a great evening, everyone.